Azmeh is a political sociologist at the University of Cambridge, where she is a research and teaching associate in political sociology. She is also a fellow of Selwyn College. Her research centers on the cultural sociology of exile, the political sociology of knowledge production, and the dynamics of revolutions and counter revolutions, with a particular focus on the contemporary Middle East. How amazing is that biography, isn't it? And her expertise spans cultural sociology, the sociology of intellectuals, memorialization, and migration, particularly within the context of forced displacement. And Zeina has two amazing books, and I really highly recommend. So the first is Syrian Intellectuals in Exile, The Dilemmas of Revolution and the Cost of Living, and it was recently published by Cambridge University Press. And her forthcoming book, The Exiled Scholar, Knowledge, Power, and Intellectual Agency Under Authoritarianism, is under contract with Routledge. Her work has appeared in various journals, and I can share this biography with you later. But she's worked with organizations including British Council and the Council for Age-Risk Academics. She's a co-founder and co-chair of the Board of Trustees of the Syrian Academics and Researchers Network in the UK, and an active contributor to a range of public engagement and impact initiatives focused on higher education, academic freedom, and displayed scholar. So here I'm really delighted to present to you Zeina Azmeh. Let's welcome her.
Thank you so much, Leila, for such a generous introduction. So today I'm going to talk about a project that's very nascent, it's very new. It is based on some of my previous work, interviews with Syrian intellectuals in exile, but also on some autobiography, my own experience in the UK asylum system, and some conversations, theoretical conversations with colleagues at the sociology departments. I realized that, I didn't understand the audience when I was preparing this presentation, so it's very much based on an audience of both policymakers and kind of social theorists. So bear with me and feel free to guide me if I kind of go in the wrong direction in terms of understanding my audience. But basically, what I try to do, can we get the presentation? Is build on something called existence theory, which is a social theory, first published by Bert et al., a group of sociologists, some of whom here at the University of Cambridge. The premise is simple. The premise is that human life is to be perceived as complete, to be experienced as complete. There are expectations for certain milestones to be accumulated over the course of a lifetime. So this could be completing education, finding employment, maybe starting a family for some, etc., buying a house, whatever it might be, depending on the individual and how they're socially situated, and also on their own kind of value system and expectations and circumstances. And the issue that I take, or the qualification I'm trying to make to this theory, but also a number of theories of late modernity that are increasingly focusing on how lives are curated in late modernity, how they are kind of designed, how we can think of singularity. There's a number of social theories that are focused on how in late modernity kind of these lives are designed and curated in a kind of an existential way. And what I problematize in this theory is the fact that it's very much based on kind of wealthy in post-industrial societies. The vast majority of the planet is not at all curating their experiences or designing them in any way. In fact, increasingly, lives are fragmented, non-linear, and this creates, for many, a sense of incompleteness in their life experience, which has very serious repercussions on the very possibility of actually viewing their lives as livable at all. So I want to suggest that much of, thank you, shall I use this one? No, this one. Scroll down. Okay. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I want to suggest that much of the existing literature, both within existence theory and all of these late modernity theories, is kind of erasing the experience of majority world, like a lot of social theory, and kind of basing their universalizing ideas on minority world experiences. In fact, disruption, well, disruption is actually the norm if we look from a global perspective. And it's, fragmented life trajectories are imposed through repeated disruptions that are increasingly systemic and often violent in nature. Life trajectories cannot really be planned, let alone accumulatively curated under such conditions, as a lifetime's reserve of energy is consumed in continually reassembling what has been interrupted, taken, or undone. And this is particularly salient or visible in the case of exiles, forcibly displaced people. So from an existence theory perspective, what happens to forcibly displaced people can be described as a collapse in the, or at least a destabilization in the existential ladder. The idea that there's a ladder on which, we accumulatively build a life is completely collapsed, because once they cross the border, many of their previously acquired or achieved milestones have to start all over again. And in current understandings of, forced displacement related policies, it seems to me that this is not accounted for. What is accounted for is kind of the immediate, survival needs. I mean, Agamben and others, many have talked about this idea of, bare life, or the idea that these policies are designed to accommodate for the basic survivability of the body, the biology of the human, rather than understand them as fully human people with aspirations, dreams, expectations, life trajectories, life narrative, stories to tell, and dreams to accomplish or to try to achieve. And there are multiple cases that illustrate this exhaustingly cyclical nature of displacement, particularly refugees who fled to neighboring countries only to be displaced again. Think of Palestinian refugees in Kuwait before once the war happened, in Iraq, in Syria, and more recently Syrian refugees in Lebanon, being replaced, Rohingya communities displaced from Myanmar to Bangladesh, wow, Afghan, etc. So many communities. So for them, this brings us to the idea of starting from zero. Many of my participants would talk about starting over or starting from zero, the idea that everything they've worked towards, maybe they bought a house, maybe they completed the education, but it's not recognized in the new place, so they have to get qualifications all over again or downgrade significantly, etc. So this idea of a curated life is completely out of the question, and this is something that is increasingly common. I mean, I'm talking, of course, about the extreme example of double or triple, in some cases, exile. But it happens, these disruptions, these fragmentations happen at so many other levels also. So from the perspective of existential theory, having to redo previously accumulated milestones, working towards previously accumulated, is like an existential downgrade. You've gone down a number of steps in the ladder and you have to start over again. There's something very Sisyphean about it, right? This idea that you push the rock all the way to the end, it's often already knowing that it's very likely that you're going to have to start over. And what does that do to the sense of, a complete life, or, a lived life, a livable life, right? In some cases, these milestones have to go all the way to the beginning, like acquiring a language, just learning to speak a language like children, including for people who might have, reached, a certain quite advanced stage in their existential ladder, right? So I'm suggesting, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting about all of these. How do I, okay, stop. Further, yeah, sorry. How do I do it? Okay. Yeah. So language, yeah. So I want to propose this idea of existential governance, or the idea that forms of state power that intervene not only in kind of people's legal status or mobility, but in the very temporal structure of people's life, or the sequencing of their lives, their continuity, their capacity for accumulation, the very possibility of futurity in their, in the way they live their lives. And we've seen, in Sweden, we've seen increasingly in Britain, this is currently being negotiated. In the US, this is done by executive, order, the power of, even outside the scope of the law, how previous frameworks, I mean, many also have talked about this, are being replaced. Previous frameworks that saw forced migration or refugees as kind of trajectories towards settlement are being reconsidered, in some cases already reversed. And this leads us to think about kind of sovereign reversibility and existential irreversibility, or, reversible policies and irreversible lives. And yeah, so the domination entailed in this existential governance is reinforced by the state's ability to reverse in its policies, but also by its use of weighting, because in many of these cases, I mean, in Denmark so far, and in the UK, what we're seeing is not yet mass repatriation, but mass limbo. People are just kept waiting for longer and longer periods in this limbo state, sometimes, even legally ambiguous state, before they can, with unclear, I mean, colleagues have, in the room have referred to this earlier. And that's a form of domination. I mean, Bourdieu talks about how waiting is a form of kind of dominating another. And systemically, these waiting mechanisms are used. We were just talking in the break about how when the regime fell, within days, people, asylum applicants, seekers had received a letter. So it's not an issue of kind of bureaucracy or slow administration or lack of resources. It's actually, waiting as perhaps as a strategy or as a way of kind of leading people to a certain despair that will allow them to, encourage them to, voluntarily return, maybe. When it comes to this reversibility or irreversibility and these milestones, in cases of authoritarianism, one milestone is, I mean, the milestones don't have to also be just like in their private or professional lives. They don't have to be material acquisitions or symbolic acquisitions, but they can be shaped, forms of their own subjectivity, their own selfhood, because there's a kind of there's a natality for the political subject. You become born as a political subject who can exercise certain freedoms and, have a political life. And the idea of being repatriated to a context where that becomes impossible is a form of existential downgrade that is, in very subjective, at the very psychological and the selfhood level, rather than merely as like an education or a house or whatever it might be. And then finally, I'm going to kind of skip a little bit for time's sake. So 3 minutes. Okay. So maybe I won't skip. Maybe I'll, well, the PowerPoint is forcing me to, oh no, it's not. I'm just on the wrong one. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, like, we increasingly talk about emotional capitalism, this term that Eva Illouz comes up with, about how kind of increasingly emotions are institutionalized. Think about education as a great, example where there are policies actually that really focus more than ever before on the emotional well-being of students or of staff, or, increasingly she argues that emotional lives have been incorporated into capitalism. So what is striking to me is that this contrast between the increasing attention that is given to students or certain, subjects to their psychological needs and their emotional needs and their and to neurodivergence and all that, and contrasted so violently and crassly with complete disregard for other subjects' needs. For example, when refugees or asylum seekers are repeatedly asked to do this tormenting experience of an interview, which of course is understandably needed, but the repetition seems both unnecessary and often in stark contrast with this new ethos of kind of emotional institutionalization of emotions, because emotion is being considered and institutionalized in certain contexts for certain people, but completely neglected and ignored for others. And finally, I wonder if we could use the language of existence theory to talk about like an existential bifurcation where the world is divided into those who get to live existentially, to curate their lives, to design, to choose, to plan, to have a futurity, to feel a sense of a complete life in some sense, and between those whose lives are administered and governed already as devoid of such a right or such an expectation. Yeah, and just finally, the idea of being stuck in an eternal presence, like an eternal present, like Sisyphus in the midst, always perpetually kind of laboring to acquire a certain milestone, to achieve something, but sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, being forced to start all over again, occasionally, in fact, increasingly multiple times. Yeah, I mean, this slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about how kind of this is presented as a zero-sum game between the discourses of the far right, who is assuming that it is the rights of a certain also disenfranchised group, at least, that's against the interests of another disenfranchised group, more globally thinking. Whereas I'm not sure that this philosophy or this perspective of a zero-sum game is neither true nor helpful in addressing these problems. And thank you.
That was a very thoughtful presentation, and I really appreciated the theoretical lens through which you. Sure. Okay. Sure. Perfect. So thank you, Zeina, for that very important way of making us think using various theoretical lens about the eternal, perpetually pushing that boulder uphill. Now, I'm really privileged to be able to introduce you to Dr. Solawa Ibrahim, who is an associate professor of politics, development, and international relations at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. She is a senior fellow of UK Higher Education Academy and fellow of Human Development and Capability Association. She was affiliated lecturer at Center of Development Studies at Cambridge University and was director of MSc in Poverty, Inequality and Development in Global Development Institute at University of Manchester. She was visiting professor at University of Maryland, USA, and Roma, Roma Tre, Italy, in Egypt. She was previously worked at AUC, American University of Cairo, UNDP, and Arab Reform Forum. Her main research areas include politics of poverty reduction, human development, political formation, gender, political Islam, governance, and grassroots democracy in the Middle East. Over to you, Salwa. Let's welcome her to start with. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Just to check the technology. Huh? Yeah, okay. Right, so good afternoon. I thought that the after lunch slot is the doomed one, but this is even worse because we're getting later in the day. So I thought of being useful, even if I don't end up saying something helpful. So I ended up making a list of some of the questions we've gathered all day. So Simon asked us, who is heard? Then Pauline, you talked about the lived realities. Mizna, you talked about young people who think carefully and creatively about the challenges that they face themselves. Then the Pro-Vice Chancellor talked about the need to listen. Michelle, you had a lot of things we're going to have in common, but one of them is the everyday experiences, the political questions, and power relations. Maha and Katerina, you talked about the E, which is education. I'm going to talk about another E, empowerment. Georgia, you talked about frameworks and refugee-centered approaches, something that hopefully will resonate today. Faiza talked about not confusing voice with power. And Laila talked about the intersectionality of struggle. Ali, you talked about heterogeneity of refugees and displaced people. And then Zeina, you talked about zero-sum game. So I'm here to try and give a bit of a glimpse of maybe some practical proposal. It starts theoretically, but it goes more into a practical proposition of how, hopefully, I'm not trying to answer your very difficult questions, Laila, absolutely not, but I'm trying to come to or make a proposal of what I would call the 3 C's. So 3 processes that I think can help with the empowerment process of refugees and displaced people. Now, this is a caveat that this is work in progress. I come to this from the field of international development, having known Maha, known for me as Mimo, for ages. Obviously, couples start to think alike. So after many years of working in the international development field, I wanted to learn more about migration, refugee studies. So just to give a caveat that a lot of the theoretical background I'm going to present to you today comes from the human development and capability approach, from the ideas of agency, freedom, and political choice. Now, this is a project I'm working on basically to try and contrast the voices of refugee groups here in the UK with the dominant policy narratives. So trying to understand or explain or wish for a common policy framework where those voices are not just consulted, as Faiza mentioned, but rather integrated within these policy frameworks. So we need to aim high, not just including them, but rather making them shape those policies. Now, the argument I'm having here is that obviously, as we've already mentioned, there is a hostile environment that refugees and asylum seekers live in. At the same time, many of the policies that govern their lives have ignored their voices and their agency. And that's why the lived experiences and the voices need to be an integral part of that kind of policy, of the policy framework I'm going to try and suggest. I'm not going to go too much into detail. Some of things I will skip, but just wanted to start. I'm going to give a glimpse because the Ukrainians, I'm not Ukrainian, I'm Egyptian, but because the Ukrainians were mentioned quite a lot today, one of the case studies, we're doing a contrast between the Ukrainian and the Syrian refugees in the east of England. So I'm going to bring in a bit of a glimpse to show that even with the legal exceptionalism of the Ukrainians, there are still issues around their uncertainty, their non-linearity, unpredictability of their futures that really still affect their mental health. Okay, so why aim high for refugee empowerment and not just focus on particular aspects or domains like education or employment or elsewhere? Because basically there is an urgency. We obviously understand that from all the lovely photos that Laila shared with us. We're living through that kind of turmoil. At the same time, there is a lot of volatility, uncertainty with people's lives, regardless of whether you are coming from the displaced backgrounds or you're living in those communities. Obviously, there is the rise of the far right, the latest local elections. And finally, also we need to think about more sustainable solutions rather than, as was mentioned already, we're very reactive in a lot of the scholarship as well as in a lot of the policies we undertake. So the main question here is about this gap what happens? Why is there this growing gap between the realities of people who come from displaced and refugee migrant backgrounds and the political narratives? And here I want to bring in the conceptual framework I was telling you about. So I've worked over 20 years in Egypt, Senegal, even in Salford, Greater Manchester area, and I started very much romanticizing collective initiatives, community organizations, very much, yes, let's do things, power up, bottom up, sorry, and grounded, etc. But soon I realized that there is a bit of a ceiling to those initiatives. And hence, I kind of gradually over the years refined a model that I'm trying to propose here for conceptualizing refugee empowerment, where we really need to work on 3 different levels. First, we need to work on the individual. So the migrants, the displaced persons themselves, but also the local communities in which they live. So they need to think critically about the experiences of those migrants, that is in the host communities, or the migrants themselves need to think, as Zeina just mentioned, about their constant existential struggle that they have to go through. Next is the collective level. So as Laila called us for the revolution and resistance, we're in a panel on resistance. So here is the power of the collectivity. And I worked a lot on the concept of collective capability. So things that people together can achieve that each individual alone cannot. I very much believe in that. However, there is, as I mentioned, a ceiling to this. So here I'm proposing the need to build on that to introduce the 3rd C, which is collaboration. So once partners like FCDO, like NGOs, like INI, all the other civil society organizations, they come together and they build on these other 2 steps. So one change at one level alone is insufficient and unsustainable. That's basically what I want to say. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to briefly mention that we are doing, we're conducting interviews, we're doing document analysis of UK policy frameworks. That's why I love the unwelcome to Denmark, because we're also following the policy narratives in the UK context. And we're also doing the visual narratives. So asking those refugees to bring in an item that they have brought from home and what that represents for them. Again, going into the direction, as Laila mentioned, of exhibition and visualization of that experience of refugees and migrants. In terms of, as I'm already mentioned, we're doing an inter-group comparison, so contrasting Ukrainian and Syrian voices, but we're also articulating the voices of civil society organizations, particularly in the east of England, and those working in local councils and other government officials. Now, what I want to present finally to you is that kind of mini contrast with regard to the Ukrainian case in particular. So obviously, government narratives, before we go into the Ukrainian case study, the government narratives have changed and shifted, as we already heard several times today, particularly from 2012, the institutionalization, I would call, of the hostile environment, then the Stop the Boat, the Rwanda bill, trying to restore control over migration and particularly focus on, obviously, the securitization of migrants as threats, externalization of the migration diplomacy, transactional deals with France, one in, one out, and restoring that kind of border control narrative. However, when it comes to the Ukrainian refugees, or I was told in a conference a few weeks ago not to call them refugees because they are guests, but I'm still gonna call them refugees, okay? Right. So the UK policies towards Ukrainians, we have talked a lot today about this kind of exceptionalism. And I don't want to mention, here I'm not trying to prove that they are that they are not legally exceptional. Yes, they are provided with privileges that other displaced groups are not, like the being treated as home students in universities, like being able to work, etc. However, it was interesting, or the question I was struggling with is, okay, given those privileges, quote unquote, how is their experiences of displacement? What do they see as a good life? What are their aspirations? How does that experience of displacement affect them? And just sharing here three key areas that they mentioned. One of them is when it comes to their perception of a good life, health comes first, but also the point, again, what Michelle mentioned, uncertainty. The issue about not being able to provide for their children, their grandchildren, not knowing what's going to happen to the future, the peace in their countries, in their home countries. Similarly, the problems, again, one of the key points here is that even though they have access to the Homes for Ukraine scheme, as in housing, they also have been perceived as, relatively white, if one might use that word. But nevertheless, their feeling of homesickness and inclusion is still very nuanced, is very incomplete. The reason being is that when they communicate with locals, there are so many cultural processes that they are themselves not familiar with either, similar to experiences of other migrants coming from Afghani, Syrian, or other displaced backgrounds. Finally, in terms of their aspirations, yes, issues around good health and employment are important. But what I found completely and very revealing is that, again, that kind of commonality of the experience, in the uncertainty about their future, in the fact that they are willing to, wanting to have better income and housing, but at the same time, their mental health still struggles. So basically, what I would like to end up with, and just very quickly, I compared these findings with other studies that try to articulate voices of Ukrainian guests. And then there is a lot of commonality across, because this is a small sample. We could not considering this study as being, a wider generalizable one. Finally, just want to end with aspiration for a bigger project. Hopefully we can expand that to include more voices from host communities, because again, one of the things I really, and I don't mean to be critical here, I'm a newbie to the area, but I felt from having attended a number of events for refugees and it's Refugee Week that we kind of end up talking to the converted. And I have a problem with that. We want to challenge those who are not. And maybe joining them on the streets to dance, but also trying to create other forums. I love the idea of food, getting them around food or exhibitions, but something around the host communities. Media representations we talked about. I mean, what the simplicity of the messaging, the kind of representation, the fact how many people know that most of the refugees and displaced people actually live in the global south? Where is this message? Why is it not reinforced? So, in conclusion, yes, this is a panel about resistance and alternative approaches. Can it work? Well, we need to kind of create that common and cooperative coordinated framework that links the narratives at the policy level with the individual's aspirations, but also with the collective struggle and resistance of communities on the ground. Thank you.